Hello and welcome back to another episode of our Mega-lo-Mania in Unreal Engine. Unfortunately, wasn't able to stream it over the weekend as planned, but I was able to make some changes and make some progress. So, what I have done since the last stream, if I can remember all the bits and pieces, was... Oh, wrong one. Change the right game. That's fine. So what we have here is the map being shown, the game speed icon just for placement. We have the castle and its flag, all in about the right place, and the sector is being displayed. I believe I may have done some of the minimap in the last stream. I can't 100% remember where I even was then. But I have fixed it up so that it's interactive. You can now move between the sectors, and the main slab sector image updates along with the castle being displayed or not displayed. Obviously, as we can see, the castle is also displayed on the minimap for the appropriate sector. So the minimap is fairly complete. It's got the castle logic in, and it's even got some army up logic in, which is where I'm working on and will continue to work on today. So again, still kind of working on semi-prototype-esque type implementation for the armies, just to kind of get the basic functionality in. I have added this make army button, and that will spawn some army people, and hopefully from that we'll be able to do the interactions that we expect to do with the army. So the minimap is using the MLM map that was created before. Stop that. And it is also using this MLM map section. And the map section has, where does it start? A number of bits of construction. It uses the sector type, so it's been given the sector, the biome. I think the sector type is a little bit superfluous in the sense that it actually does have access to the sector, so it doesn't need to set it. However, I've left it like that so that I can set the sector type in the editor for the given widget. So if we select the top level, we can see the sector type here, and I can actually change that and ensure that each of them are rendered. One issue that I had was particularly with the overlapping part of the image. So as you can see, this image is actually outside of the main screen border for this, or outside the main canvas, I suppose, for better description. And there's a space around the kind of bulk of the land mass of that particular sector. So if we pick the island one, that's a good one. So we can see that even in this case there's a bit of water in there, but it's fairly centered, but there's always 3 pixels of water around the edge. And one issue that I was getting with the selection and the clicking was issues where the mouse would click on the wrong one because it was over the join part. So that was a bit difficult to overcome. I've made it so that there's a border for the click interaction, because then I can focus that in the space that actually wants to interact with the click. I've made sure that's got a Z order higher than the rest of it, so that it takes that click and it will handle that click in the on mouse button events. I've left the on mouse move as well, so that we know when we move out of it and into it. I think the other main point was when they're all lined up within the map. Where's one? Event. Yeah, we're keeping a reference of all the sections, and we also have the click event handled within here. So lots of bits and pieces to kind of put the mini-map together, but as I say, it's kind of functioning pretty correctly. That the click accuracy is good. Depending on the sectors, there's no awkward overlap. So I'm happy with that. So the make army button, as I say, prototyping kind of implementation, but really just looking to get the armies to not only display on a sector in a manner of fashion, that's kind of the lower priority part, but predominantly show on the map. So if I actually make an army, we can see all the little people spawn in and they still move around with the same awkwardness they've had before. But most importantly, the icon for that army exists on the map. So the game recognizes the fact that there is an army there. If I actually make another one and another one and another one, we actually end up with 4 armies on the map. Don't know really what goes wrong when I have the 5th. But I haven't dealt with the merging of the armies yet either. That's probably what this error is about, actually. Yes. So that process works. We'll start in the layout where I've just placed the button. When I click the spawn button, I create an army, and this creation of the army is purely temporary prototyping implementation. But the predominant part is that we call a function on the player controller, because if the player is collecting up the army units using the interface, then the end result is going to be the same. It's going to be an array of units being a structure that I've created to hold this information. So the array of units goes into the spawn army action, and that's on the player controller, which has opened in the background, and starts here. And that's really just an initial entry point into, get that back to where it was, more or less anyway. Oh, they're all in different places. This is just an initial entry point into the event process, where the player controller would actually be holding the units more than likely, and the player controller would just pass them through, so it wouldn't actually receive anything from the action. Well, it wouldn't receive the units, I don't think, because they're coming from the UI, and the UI doesn't store the units. But specifically exactly where and what comes from, that's what this entry point's for. It allows me to kind of deal with the inputs. But most importantly, it calls the spawn player army on the server. So this is a replicated event on the server. And that means that I can validate what the user has attempted to create army-wise before actually spawning it. Again, because it's prototype, I don't actually do anything with the array of units. I just spawn the army on the appropriate sector. So we can validate that by moving over to the other sector and spawning an army there and an original. That means there's 2 armies. They both have different information. They both have a different primary actor that's holding them, but they are nice and separate. Now, the spawn army is the same army that we had before, and it adds that army to the array for the sector. Now what we need to do, instead of just simply adding it to the army array, we'll need to add it to the army array but through the sector itself, so that if the player currently already has an army on there, they'll merge, and also there currently is, within the actual game, there's a limit of 250 units per player, so we'll have to enforce that, and therefore if the player is attempting to move an army, only some of the units would move from one army to another. But the key thing is that when the player chooses to spawn an army, they should be able to choose where they spawn it, rather than just clicking make army and it appearing here. What I want to be able to do is make an army over here without actually moving onto that sector. That's kind of the plan anyway. But probably before that, just because that involves it does kind of involve certain other elements that aren't in, but an another part of it would be to be able to move an army from one place to another. So either one of those things works. That's kind of what I'm going to try and work on now. So when we click the spawn army button, if we're not actually going to spawn the army in the sector that the player is looking at, although obviously that's possible, we need to kind of enter a state of placing an army for the player itself. I think that would, in the game, would go alongside changing perhaps the mouse cursor to a particular type of cursor. I think the sword icon is the one that they use in the game, so that the player can tell that they are doing something specific. Last time I did try and use images for the cursor, it didn't really work out very well. But that might have been more the fact that some of the other configuration parts were wrong. It's not a point. There we go. So I think it's a software one we want. So I don't know if I can actually change this, but crosshair and hand would actually be reasonable choices to just keep it simple, rather than worrying too much about the images. So I think what we're going to need for this is a player state. The player state is going to hold, naming it before I've picked it, hold the state of the player. And in this case, the state of the player would be something like placing a. Do I already have that then? I must already have created that at some point. So I'm not really sure how many states there would be. So already I must have just clicked off it. Yeah, so I don't know how many player states there are at this point. Kind of different states, either that are there to be visual to the player or to do other logic. But that's not too important. We can focus on the states we know. We'll call it player state E. So not be very creative with this. It's like you've got, I think we'll call it active army active army. Back over here. So the player state would be by default. The default value, which is there. I think all we need to do is, rather than spawn it for this event, we want to get the player state. Have to set it somewhere, probably in the game mode. can't find my second player state, game state base. So for some reason it's not showing up on the list. That might mean because I've got many of them. It's this one. It's not the player state that I want. Based on the description of the player state may not be the same kind of thing as what I'm thinking, but it probably could go in the player controller for all it matters. Yeah, let's put it in the player controller, although there's a player state variable. I'm going to call it action state. Figure out why it's not showing up on as an actual thing some other time. So this may be a client only thing. I don't think there's any scenario in which the server needs to be aware of what the state is in. That's not really what we want to do. So when we click the button, we set the appropriate state. Now I guess we could set the cursor. Can we do that from here? Set current mouse cursor, yes. Now we could have this done kind of automatically depending on the state at some point. Either an event or something like that, but for now we'll just do it all in one place. So that should mean that when I click my button, well, nothing happens. Oops, did not mean to do that. I'm going to have to wait for it to load. Ah, okay, so it does work. Works when we click. Yeah, it doesn't really perform very well. It's not in the way that I expected it to work. What we will do instead is drop down an image in my vertical box, center it, and find the appropriate sword icon. Any one of them will do. That'll do. So we're just going to get this icon to show up when we get into that state. Again, just as a temporary. Forgot what I called it. Action state. So basically the icon should show up if we are in the proper state, otherwise it should not. Very straightforward. Just trying to keep that visualization there, but without getting bogged down about the details of mouse cursors and whatnot right now. So we know we're in that state. In the typical game, the user would start kind of adding units to their army and before they actually deploy it. And I think I will refer briefly back to the game. I don't know what click, whether it's left or right, that they do in various places. But there will definitely be a click on the slab area, and currently that's not possible. But whether it's limited to the actual slab or whether it's just that side of the screen, I don't know either. So I do know that the player can put the army back by clicking on the castle. So we need to deal with that one next. It looks like it's kind of anywhere in that space, as much as one can put their mouse. But we also can place directly to a sector on the map. We right click to pick them up. Oh, and they flash. That's interesting. Again, you can move them to a sector on the map. If you put them back into the same sector, they go into the castle. Good to know. And finally, I know you can pick them up and click on the castle itself. So that's kind of the interaction we're going to go with. Flashing is optional. Might have to come back to that one. Okay, so player enters the army state by what will become selecting army people in this context. Let's just make something else while we wait. So doing that puts the player in the army state. Then they should be able to click on the sector, the castle, obviously not when they're placing it for the first time, or any sector on the map. Oh, pressed escape by accident. Thought that it was my own game. So when we're in this state, clicking on the sector shouldn't change the sector. So now we need to go back over to the map. This is where we deal with clicking on a sector, but we actually pass it straight into this function. We don't need to worry about what we're going to do here. So that should be on clicked section. Well, I'll call them sector, section. I think that event might be a bit wrong named, but nonetheless, when we click at one, we go straight into the player controller. So we don't have to worry here what should happen really. I mean, it's just the user's just clicked on a bit of the map. Now it's up to the player controller to do what needs to be done. So somewhere in here, we've got it here. So on click sector, normally we determined a mouse button and we haven't actually handled what right mouse button does yet on the minimap. I'll go with a few more this time, just so we've got some to make other army pieces while we're discussing it. So if we add some more here, so we can left click, which just moves us between the sectors, but we can also right click here and then left click where we want. So right click picks up an army. So don't think we want any of that. Actually we do, don't we? We want the active sector at the very least. So that the active sector is a sector the player is looking at. Actually no, that doesn't make any sense because we want the sector they've clicked on, which is this one here. So in the left click place, we just move the minimap over to the appropriate sector. In the right click place, we need to, if they've got an army, make that the active army. So what we're going to do is add an army, an active army variable. I'm just going to call that the army. In the right order. To set it to not get it. So on, that's the left click of a sector, that's the right click. If we're right clicking, then we will need to get the sector armies, which I think is this one. Okay, armies. Now we might want a convenience function on the sector or some other way of getting them rather than looping through them in this context, but again, this one should be fine for now. Do a break so we can stop once we've found it. If it's right click, loop through let's bring this down a bit. Loop through all of the armies. We need to know what the army has that tells us who it belongs to. So that's actual man, that's not the one we want. That's the one we want. guess this probably actually has just an owning player, so we can probably do that. So that is a army. So get owner, and if that is the same as us, army should be owned by the player controller. We will set that, and then we'll break. Now with that, we should be able to make the map blink for the army. So update function is the function we're currently doing all of the work for a given sector in. And then we're just calling appropriate functions on the individual sections to do what needs to be done. So this bit here basically displays all of the armies. Obviously there's no reason why armies couldn't have more than 4, and then we wouldn't be able to display them very well, but that's not for that class to kind of control. We do only have the select here. Yeah, so the army actors is used, the army actors owner is used here to set the color, so that's okay. And then we set the visibility here. So the blinking is quite difficult because we need something to say whether we should or shouldn't be showing it, and then how long it should be shown or not shown for. So I think we will come back to the blinking of the active army. But so we've right clicked, we've now found and set our active army. If we've clicked the spawn button, then our active army should be set as well. I mean, potentially that kind of makes the action state somewhat superfluous because we've got an active army. Now obviously in this case the active army may be completely empty, and it certainly wouldn't be rendered in the game yet. So whether there should even be an active army, I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. Because until they've actually clicked in the game space, we certainly wouldn't spawn it and show it with any visual output. So while we're using the state, all of this is true, we need to set the state to active army as well. But it does seem like we've almost got duplicate information here. Okay, so now if we've left clicked on our sector, which is this bit over here, we do need to determine what state we're in. Now if we're in the default state, I suppose actually a switch, we're going to do more than one, not a branch. If we're in the default state, we need to do basically what we did before. If we are in the active army state, we will move the army from one sector to another. So just thinking that through, because as we've said before, only part of the army may move if they've got more than 250 units in a particular space. I think that restriction, while it may be a bit superfluous in the current kind of engine and things like that, we surely could render 250 units of each player in one go, so a total of 1,000 probably. I think we can anyway. Obviously, if you're rendering 1,000 little men walking around, you wouldn't be able to really see them anyway. So it's normally kind of a portion of the army that would be rendered. But that doesn't mean to say that we can't store more than 250 in each army. But the restriction has to be possible, because that may just be a good rule for the game. Whether it's flexible or not depends on the game rules themselves. But we should account for that in how we move one army from one sector to another. So the simplest way to achieve that I can think of is basically to have a function that takes all three kind of components that are involved. For the time being, we're going to put this function on this class on the player controller, and we'll call it move army. Actually, that's not true. Are we? We'll leave it here, but it certainly has to be something that's called by the server, not by the client. So I almost missed that. When we're changing the selection, that's certainly something that can be done by the client itself. The active sector, I think, is going to pretty much be irrelevant depending on exactly how we do the clicking of the main area space. So the creation of an army through the method of picking up here and clicking actually in this space here. We may need to know the main sector, or we may be able to figure out by what we've clicked on. But the active sector is not too important for the server. The active army isn't important because the server won't do anything with it. But we do need to tell the server to do the move. So I think rather than a function at this point, we will create another custom event, and this will be, oh okay, so the sector is being ran on the server. Okay, I suppose that does make some sense, because we do have to possess the sector when we've selected it. That means we probably don't need that event. We can use the function for now at least. So if we've got an active army, we do need to verify that we've got an active army. It should be valid, but we'll check anyway. And now we just call our function. So just do this so that we can. So first it's the army from which sector to which sector. So army from and to. Don't know if we're going to really care too much about whether it's successful or not, but I'll put that boolean just in case for the time being. So yeah, actually we don't want from. We should know the from, because the from comes from the army. The army's got to be somewhere, I believe. the army should store where it is. It currently doesn't. Does that make sense? Yeah, see, I was unsure about that, whether the army should store where it is too. So it just means we'd have to keep those two things in sync. It would be distinctly possible for the army to say it's in one sector, but the sector to think that it's somewhere else, or not there. So it'd be a bit annoying if that would be the problem, if that turned up. So that being the case, we currently don't know where the particular army is, because we're not given it, or we don't figure it out from here. What we do know is what the active army is and where it's going. I guess we could just quickly add find sector for army. Did not work. We need to set it, drag it from there. So we need to get all of the sectors. Get all active of class, that's what we're looking for. We'll have the break in there as well, because we know we'll stop as soon as we find it. So again, they've got an array of armies, so we have to go through those as well. Owner sector. So if the army is that one, too short. There. So that one. So we're basically getting all the sectors for each of that. If we've got an owner sector already, then if that's valid, then we break out of that and we go straight into our return. If it's not valid, we go through all of the armies on that sector, we find the appropriate one, by the equals, and if we find that one, then we break out of that loop, which will obviously in turn cause that to be set, which we forgot to set. That would not work. A sector should be this one. About higher. So that should return the sector for a given army. Bit of a long-winded way of doing it. Whether it would be better to have the army reference it, who knows? I mean, we could have the army reference it and events occur. That might be better, but we'll keep going with this, and then I can maybe clean it up a bit later once we've got all the bits and pieces in place. So, find sector for army. First task. That gives us the FOM, so we can ignore the FOM value. Now our first kind of draft at this, we just simply want to take the army out of one sector and into another. So from that sector we're going to have remove army, which we need to add to the actor. So I think we will have to be ran on the server, and we want to really do it in one go again. On the army. That's not where that goes. No wonder I couldn't find it. I was meant to be opening the sector, not the army. Don't need a FOM because the FOM is obviously this sector. Keep it on the server. Yeah, so that indicates that it would be better to have the find this part of the find at least on the sector itself. So we'll do find index of army, or more specifically find army index. So a lot of what that will do is basically what we had before. Input will be an army. That's not what we wanted it to be. It's close. So if we find it, we want to remember the index. And then we want the break. It's easier to do it the way that I normally did it in that case. There we go. So that will return us an index for the army that we have found. I'm not sure if we need to set it locally or we could just use the index when we break, but just because I can be sure that that works as I require, I use that. So when we're moving the army, the first thing we're going to need to do is find the index for it. The default value for that should be -1, not 0. So we jump back over to our function and set that. So now we can, this being the sector, call find army index instead of doing the for each. Basically say if that's greater than 0, then everything else is the same. That one. Just a slightly more concise bit of code there, rather than having to have the loop, the two loops. We can just loop internally here. If it's greater than 0, then we've found the sector for it, and we set it accordingly. Don't need that one. Bit cleaner, slightly less overlap in the nodes. Okay, so back to here. So we find the sector for the army using the function that we previously defined. Then we call on that sector the move army function. That's the army. That one should be one of those instead. And then we're done. Can't have a return value from an event, so it's fine. So we need to find the index for the army on the current sector. We need that so that we can remove it. And we can get the armies on the new sector. And again, we're not going to worry about the merging part immediately. We are going to add it. And then from this sector, we're going to remove index. Doing it that way around just means that we can guarantee that the army is never in nowhere. And we're doing it on the server, so that should replicate. So let's see how that works or not, as a case may be. Oh, we don't have an army to move. That's a bit of an issue. We'll have to just switch back to the player controller. That was on this spawn army, which we call that. So we'll skip that. I think we're set in the state when we right click here. Need to set it back once we've moved. Okay, so let's have a look at the message log. So we first make the army, that gives us our default one. Right click on our sector. It's not working. Okay, so the right click didn't do what I thought it should. Okay, so we'll just put a check here, not that one. So if it's not valid, we can say no player army in sector. So if we right click now, we should see that text. Yep. If we make an army and right click, okay, so we didn't see that text, so active army is true. Now if we left click somewhere else, I think it did take 2 clicks. Right click, left, left. Yeah, so the first click is doing something. Must be going into move army. Just not doing it. Right click, left click. So we have an army, we have a sector. Okay, we didn't find it. valid. Find index. So we've got an army C0. Should be our first item. Yep. This is greater than 0, yeah, so we're not working with 0, that's the wrong way around. I think it might be better to just do not equals. Yeah, it's generally more consistent with those kind of checks. So now we do have a target sector. We obviously should have an index again. It doesn't look like we do. I think we add the index to the other sector. Yeah, we've added it to both places, but we haven't removed it from the other because for some reason we didn't find it the second time. It doesn't really make a great deal of sense. So this should be the second attempt. Obviously I have army C0 again. We have an array of that. That worked. So our array is empty in this context. I guess we might not be on the right sector. So it should be on the sector which owns the army. So based on that, it looks about right. Our sector is C1. I assume this sector is C0. Yeah, trying to move it to C1. Yeah, so our array has 0 is 0 and 1 is 1. That's fairly straightforward. Moving it to 1. It should be in here. It should be running on the server as well, so call stack is so confusing. I think we may have used the same name here more than once. Yeah, we'll move army on the sector. That shouldn't be a problem. Doesn't seem to be able to. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be able to tell me quite where I am. armies in a sector should be replicated anyway. Even if this was on the client, which it shouldn't be, because it's calling executed on server. Don't think that should be the case. Nope, so it's definitely authorized. Rather than that, we can rely on the return value. So that should at least stop it being in both places. Or not. Gotta get it right. That one should be the same as well. So if it's not equal to -1, we found the owning sector. If it's not equal to -1, we should add it and remove it. Add it to the new sector we've clicked, remove it from the current sector. But if that is true, what we might not be doing correctly is updating the UI. Never had an army go away again. So we display the army for each of the armies. But we don't take them away. For that we need the sector, or the section even. I suppose the same would apply to a castle, but we can just quickly jump back over here. I wonder if the colours are always the same. Green is always in the top right. It's not massively important, but it would help in the context of icons disappearing. So it would be slightly nicer not to have to hide them every frame and then make them appear every frame. Let's do yellow. So we know red turned up on the top right there. Oh, nicely we got blue. So give it long enough, we should get an idea of where they go. So blue's in the bottom, yellow's in the bottom left. Hopefully blue will send out some people before they disappear. Yeah, so the blue's in the bottom right. If we run away. Okay, so that changes the logic a little bit, but actually makes it, as I say, a little bit easier because we don't have to worry about... So at the moment we're iterating over the armies, which obviously is only going to work if we have 4. What we probably should do is a loop, and first index is 0, last index is 3. Yep. And this will be that's our name. So which army, because we need to know the colour, the index, because we need to know the place, well actually the obvious point would be if there's no army, there's no point in showing it, so we shouldn't need another boolean in there. Get back over to the map. So at the moment the map just stores an array of them, and since my toggle army can handle them being different colours, I think the easiest approach would be to just get from that array the index that we want. If it's there. So length. It's less than. This one. So if our index is less than the length of the item, so if we have 4 armies, the length would be 4. that's true, then we want to call that with an army on that index for that sector. And if it's false, we just don't call that. A little bit more organised. There's quite a lot going on now. I'll do for now. So we're basically iterating over the 4 spots. If we can get an army for that spot, then we display it, otherwise we don't. Now we need a quick validation check on the army. If it is valid, we'll go through the sequence of finding the appropriate sprite, setting the brush, and setting the visibility. If it is not valid, we can just switch straight to the set visibility as collapsed. Okay. Probably set the visibility to the wrong thing there, didn't I? That's better. Make the army. We don't have an army now. Why don't we have the icon showing? So if we've got one army, the length would be 0. If that index is less than or equal to, I think is probably what we want. Less than or equal. No. Less than. So length will be 1, index will be 0. That's better. There we go. We moved. Okay, I think on that note, I'm gonna end for the evening. I have my army moving. It doesn't visually show up once the men have wandered off. They've wandered off. But what I need to do in that case is to work on the actual army kind of graphic part of it itself. But the process of moving isn't as clean as I'd like in part, but I can, once I've got all the flow working for kind of army control, I can fix some of it. So yeah, that's all for now, and I will be back later on in the week. Thank you very much. Bye for now.